It was generally agreed, though not, of course, by the late Colonel Marchbanks himself, that the only thing more ill-tempered than his mastiff was the Colonel's pianoforte playing. Both were voluble, erratic, and could clear a room within moments. But whereas Brutus the Mastiff had the decency to limit his thunderings to the garden path and lower servants, the Colonel's daily assault on Beethoven's Appassionata resounded through the drawing-room like a Wagnerian siege, particularly inconvenient when one was attempting to host an afternoon bridge party. It was, therefore, all the more provoking when the Colonel, having produced a particularly ghastly rendition of the second movement, was discovered precisely 20 minutes later, propped stiffly on the brocade ottoman, mustaches perked in eternal surprise, a faint violet tinge about his ears, and quite devoid of life. The score had fallen neatly from the music stand, like a servant resigning in quiet protest. Lady Marchbanks, a woman whose facial expressions ranged from faint disapproval to formal displeasure, had merely glanced at the body, sighed, and requested that someone ring up the doctor, and please ask Mrs. Calthorpe to delay the syllabub. Thank you. The doctor, a tweedy man of uncertain convictions, arrived with the punctuality of a man well accustomed to the eccentricities of the Marchbanks household. He diagnosed an acute coronary incident, poked vaguely at the surrounding objects as though they might spring to life and correct him, and declared the matter unfortunate, but unsurprising. Colonel Marchbanks had, after all, abused cigars, claret, and Chopin with equal enthusiasm for over 50 years. That any of them had outlived him was, to his mind, the true mystery. It might have ended there, as so many country fatalities do, tidily, with wreaths and whispered relief, had not a certain Mr. Bunter, travelling in advance of his employer, stopped to inquire, with great urbanity, whether the north-facing room with the peculiar yellow curtains might be prepared for Lord Peter Wimsey, recently returned from a particularly dull symposium on heraldic forgery in Geneva. "Oh," said Lady Marchbanks after a pause of surgical length, "that Lord Peter Wimsey." Bunter, who never answered rhetorical questions, merely inclined his head with the gravity of a minor canon pronouncing a benediction. Thus it was that, some 36 hours after the Colonel's demise, Lord Peter Wimsey arrived at High Bracken House with an overnight valise, 3 volumes of Donne in Latin, and an ironic glint in his monocle. The drawing-room fire had been coaxed into life. A discreet tray of anchovy toast and a decanter of Amontillado awaited him. Wimsey took one look at the armchair arranged opposite the ottoman, still marked with the indentation of its late occupant, and turned to Bunter with a moue of distaste. "My dear man," he said, "I am not as a rule unnerved by death, but one does prefer one's drawing-rooms unoccupied by the recently expired. It lends a sort of ghoulish intimacy to the upholstery." "Quite so, my lord. And the doctor? Completely satisfied, I take it?" "As far as I gathered, my lord, he was more interested in luncheon than in N6. Wimsey's gaze travelled to the pianoforte, where the Appassionata still lay open like a crime scene confessional. He stepped lightly to it, flipped the pages, sniffed the tuning hammer, why not, and frowned delicately. "Brutus is also dead, I presume?" "No, my lord, locked in the stables for biting the stable boy yesterday morning." "Ah, the beast survives, but not the beast's master. There's a sermon in that, Bunter, if one were inclined to moralize." "I believe you're expected to dine at 8, my lord." "So soon? I'd hoped to linger with the corpse a while longer. It seemed so companionable. Still, duty calls, and roast pheasant waits for no man." But as he turned toward the staircase, Wimsey paused. His hand rested on the carved banister, and his eyes lingered on a faint stain in the carpet, barely visible in the dusk light. It was not wine, it was not ink, and it had been trodden into the pile, despite the matting by the pianoforte. "Tell me, Bunter," he murmured, "did the Colonel have a habit of playing his sonatas in evening slippers?" "I cannot say, my lord." I suspect," said Wimsey thoughtfully, "neither could he." And with that, he bounded up the stairs, whistling an unholy mixture of Mozart and music hall, leaving behind the drawing room, the piano, and the faint suggestion that death, in this instance, might have struck a note more curious than final. Whimsy came down to dinner not 15 minutes after the bell, freshly shaven and in evening dress, as though the past day had offered nothing more disturbing than a slightly undercooked egg. He greeted Lady Marchbanks with exaggerated gallantry, took his place beside a fretful cousin of indeterminate age, and dispatched the pheasant with the skill of a man who had once bested a Balkan ambassador at game carving and never let him forget it. The dining room at High Bracken was a long, lugubrious affair, its panelling the colour of neglected port and its silver darkened by a century's worth of formal disapproval. There were 6 at table that evening. Lady Marchbanks at the head, her stepson Julian, a young man whose face wore the expression of one determined to have no opinion whatever. Miss Staveley, the late Colonel's secretary, thin-lipped and upholstered in navy serge. Dr. Brathwaite, the attending physician and part-time local classicist. Miss Calthorpe, the housekeeper, elevated for the evening to flesh out the numbers, and Lord Peter, who conversed cheerfully with all and offended no one, except perhaps Julian, who disliked all cheerfulness on principle. It was somewhere between the soup and the saddle of lamb that Whimsy, selecting a green bean with deliberation, said, "Forgive me, Lady Marchbanks, but was it common for the Colonel to practice his pianoforte playing in the afternoon?" A pause. Forks hovered. Miss Calthorpe's knife scraped faintly against her plate. "Not common," said Lady Marchbanks at last, "but neither unheard of. He had his moods, you know." "Indeed. And when the Colonel had such a mood, was it his habit to wear evening slippers while doing so?" This time the silence had weight. Julian cleared his throat. "Is this leading somewhere, Whimsy?" "Only to curiosity, my dear fellow. One must lead one's curiosity somewhere, or it becomes like a spoiled child in a perambulator, forever shrieking and jabbing its rattle into innocent bystanders. You understand?" Julian did not, but Lady Marchbanks interceded. "I cannot say what he wore, Lord Peter. I seldom inquired after his footwear." Whimsy smiled benignly. "Nor I, usually. But I noticed a rather curious pattern in the carpet by the pianoforte, a stain of some sort. Perhaps only claret, perhaps not. One hates to speculate on the vulgar, but was there any bleeding?" "None that I observed," said Dr. Brathwaite, who had until now been concentrating on his claret. Face and ears slightly discoloured. Heart failure quite sufficient. "Oh, no doubt," murmured Whimsy, "though I confess to being piqued by a man who, while expiring, appears to have trampled a considerable amount of something into a rug without being seen or heard." "Really, Whimsy," said Julian, "the doctor has given the cause of death. Must we pick it over like some ghastly tale in a penny weekly?" "Oh, but ghastly tales have their uses. They remind us that death is rarely tidy and never dull." The conversation turned after that, and Whimsy allowed himself to drift into benign irrelevance, discoursing briefly on the merits of glass decanters versus pewter, and whether Racine was better translated by lawyers or poets. After dinner, as was inevitable, the party removed to the drawing-room, minus Julian, who begged off with a headache and retired to the billiard-room, where he was heard shortly thereafter, savaging the cue-chalk with determined futility. Whimsy lingered near the pianoforte, absently fingering a discordant triad. "Miss Staveley," he said casually, as she poured out coffee from the silver pot, "were you in the house the afternoon Colonel Marchbanks died?" "I was in the study," she said. Her voice had a crisp, oxidized quality like old brass. "Preparing correspondence. The Colonel had left instructions for several letters to be typed and signed." "Ah, yes. And you heard nothing?" "Only the piano, badly played." "Unforgivable," said Whimsy gravely. "Did he summon you at all?" "No. The Colonel disliked interruptions when he was playing." "Very wise. Did you note the time?" "I usually finish correspondence by 3. I remember looking at the clock just before going to ring for tea. It It was a few minutes after 4. The playing had stopped. I assumed he had gone upstairs. But instead he had gone down, murmured Whimsy, to the great drawing-room eternal. Curious business. Lady Marchbanks coughed delicately. Lord Peter, I do hope you're not suggesting— Nothing at all, Lady Marchbanks. Only that death, like Beethoven, is not always played in the correct key. He strolled over to the fire, where Miss Calthorpe sat knitting something brown and ominous. She had a face like a churchwarden's ledger and hands like root vegetables. Whimsy bent down with interest. An Afghan? No, my lord, a tea cosy. Ah, for a very large teapot, no doubt. She looked at him, eyes unreadable. Tell me, Miss Calthorpe, he said, you've been with the family a good while, haven't you? 28 years, my lord. And do you recall the Colonel ever playing the piano in his slippers? Only when he had a chill, my lord, or after his baths. Said boots pinched when his feet were damp. And yesterday? I couldn't say. I brought up the tea tray a few minutes before 5. Found him like that. And the tea tray, was it brought in through the main drawing-room door? She hesitated. No, my lord, through the side, the one by the small corridor. Yes, the one that leads to the conservatory. Just so. Whimsy turned and strolled to the window. The darkness beyond pressed softly against the glass, and the garden lamps cast long shadows on the lawn. Somewhere in the distance, Brutus howled, and the sound skirled up through the trees like a misplayed arpeggio. Behind him, the fire crackled. The others murmured. The house itself held its breath. Do you keep the pianoforte locked? He asked suddenly. Lady Marchbanks raised an eyebrow. Of course not. Why would we? Ah, but the keys, you see. I tried a C-sharp earlier, and the string was dead, quite defunct. The hammer strikes air. And yet the Colonel played, well, attempted to play, the Appassionata without noticing. Dr. Brathwaite looked up, frowning. You're quite certain? Bunter has perfect pitch, said Whimsy simply. He noticed it first. I confirmed. I can't imagine, said Miss Staveley slowly, that the Colonel would have failed to remark on a dead note. He was a dreadful pianist, but not a careless one. Indeed. Whimsy's voice was soft. So either he didn't notice, or he never played at all. Silence bloomed again, heavy as velvet. Lady Marchbanks rose, her back iron rod straight. I believe that is quite enough for one evening. Quite right, said Whimsy cheerfully. Too much truth before bedtime is positively unwholesome. He lingered by the pianoforte a moment longer, eyes half-lidded, then turned to Bunter, who had just entered with an envelope, on a silver salver. A letter, my lord, delivered by hand. Whimsy took it, opened it with a nail, and read the contents in silence. His expression did not change. Bunter, he said, folding the letter, I believe tomorrow we ought to have a quiet word with the gardener. Ask if he might show us the conservatory path. Something about begonias, I think. And as he spoke, the fire flared briefly, illuminating the gleam of his monocle and the faint smile on his lips, as though the first bars of a long and complex sonata had finally begun. The following morning arrived with a crisp edge and a faint tang of something unsettling in the air, not decay, precisely, but the peculiar mustiness of an atmosphere in which too many things had been left unsaid. At breakfast, the conversation hovered cautiously around neutral subjects. Julian Marchbanks, still nursing the remnants of his headache, pecked at a poached egg with the wariness of a man expecting betrayal from the yolk. Miss Staveley remained silent behind her newspaper. Lady Marchbanks inquired after Bunter's coffee blend with the disinterest so pointed it nearly qualified as violence. Lord Peter, by contrast, was in resplendent form. He dissected the morning's Times with gleeful savagery, declared the crossword insultingly simplistic, and discoursed on the tragic decline of marmalade standards with the authority of a disappointed Roman senator. Only once did he allow the mask to slip, when he leaned forward with apparent casualness and asked, "Was the Colonel in the habit of receiving visitors from the village?" Lady Marchbanks blinked. "What sort of visitors?" "Oh, the usual sort. Retired majors, impassioned tradesmen, vicarage types. Anyone with a grievance or a petition. One never knows where mischief begins. Very often in the name of a good cause." She sniffed faintly. "He kept to his own affairs." "Then how fortunate," said Wimsey brightly, "that I keep to everyone else's." With that, he rose, offered a gallant bow to no one in particular, and announced his intention to commune with begonias, a remark that left Miss Staveley frowning thoughtfully into her toast. The conservatory lay at the rear of the house, reached by a narrow, carpetless corridor and a pair of tall French doors that bore the grudging patina of long neglect. It was humid inside, with a sour scent of rotting peat, but Wimsey strode in as though entering a gentleman's club. The gardener, a stooped and dust-colored man named Pollock, emerged from behind a truss of yellowing ferns with the startled air of someone caught in ecclesiastical doubt. "Morning," said Wimsey. "Lord Peter Wimsey, I believe you tend these proud chrysanthemums." Pollock, who clearly did not care for proud chrysanthemums or those who admired them, inclined his head warily. "Sir." "Splendid. You must be the man who sees all, knows all, and says nothing, a valuable position in any household. Tell me, Mr. Pollock, were you working in this part of the grounds the afternoon Colonel Marchbanks died?" Pollock rubbed the back of his neck. "I was, sir, pruning the west wall ivy. Started just before 3, kept on till 4:30. "Ah, and did you see or hear anything curious?" The man hesitated. "Might have heard the piano a bit." "Might have? Well, I didn't pay it no mind, see. Bit of banging and crashing, usual racket, but..." Wimsey's voice was very gentle. "Well, sir, now you mention it. There was a window open, drawing room, left side, just above the flower bed. I was round the corner a few minutes, came back and noticed it was shut again. Odd thing, I thought. Wind wasn't up. No one come out the side door, neither." "Very odd," murmured Wimsey. "Windows don't often open and shut themselves, unless, of course, they were frightened by Brutus." Pollock permitted himself a faint smile. "Dog weren't anywhere near. Locked up, he was?" "So he was." Wimsey tapped his fingers against a conservatory trellis, as though testing it for metaphysical weakness. "Did you happen to see who entered the house that way?" Pollock shook his head. "Didn't see no one. But I heard the side door latch. Soft like. Maybe 4:10. Most helpful." Wimsey produced a coin of uncertain denomination and pressed it into the man's hand, with the air of one tipping the oracle at Delphi. "Keep an eye on those windows, will you? They seem to have a life of their own." He returned to the house by way of the servants' stairs, where he intercepted Bunter in the act of inventorying the linen cupboard, a task he performed with the reverence of a high Anglican sacristan. "Bunter," said Wimsey, "I think we must have a word with Miss Staveley. Discreetly. I'd like to know a little more about the Colonel's correspondence." "Very good, my lord." They found Miss Staveley in the study, hunched over the Remington typewriter as though preparing a final communique to the War Office. She looked up with a flicker of irritation, which she suppressed with the professional poise of a woman who had, undoubtedly, dealt with worse interruptions from people with far more ridiculous titles. "I wonder," said Wimsey, easing into a leather wingback, "if you might indulge my curiosity a little further. You mentioned yesterday that you were typing letters for the Colonel on the day he died. Might I see them?" Miss Staveley hesitated. They were mostly routine. But routine has its charms. One likes to see what a man considered worthy of his last hours. With a sigh, she withdrew a sheaf of carbon copies from the desk drawer and passed them over. Wimsey read in silence, brow furrowed. There were 4 letters. One to the local tax office, quarrelling over a valuation. One to a solicitor in Tunbridge Wells concerning a minor change to a codicil. One to a publisher about a volume of memoirs the Colonel had briefly threatened to write. And the fourth, a note to a Mr. Aubrey Fanshawe of Fanshawe and Ricks, London. It was brief and bore only the phrase, "The matter cannot be delayed further. I insist upon your presence." 4 o'clock sharp. Whimsy's eyes lingered on it. "Do you know this Fanshawe fellow?" he asked. Miss Staveley shook her head. "Not personally. I only took dictation." "And did the Colonel mention what the matter referred to?" "No, but he was agitated, more than usual." Whimsy leaned back. "So he summons this Fanshawe person at 4, is found dead not long after, and no one seems to have seen any visitor arrive or depart. Curious. Did you hear the doorbell at all?" "No, but I was in the study." Whimsy passed the letter to Bunter, who scanned it with one raised brow. "Fanshawe and Ricks," he said. "They handled the affairs of a major Byfleet last year. I believe there was some difficulty over a contested will." "Capital." Whimsy rose, tucking the letters into his coat. "Make inquiries, Bunter. Discreet as ever. I want to know if Mr. Fanshawe is in town, and if not, when last he travelled. And ask about the Colonel's will. There's an aroma about this business, not quite brimstone, but something distinctly legal." Back in the drawing-room, he paused by the pianoforte again. The lid had been left half-lifted. He touched one key, let it ring, then another. The dead note remained dead. The Colonel, he was certain now, had never played that day, which meant the music heard by Pollock, faint, intermittent, had not come from performance, but from something staged. A gramophone, perhaps? A recording? But if someone had faked the sound of playing to create the impression that the Colonel was alive at a certain time, then the time of death had been misjudged, perhaps deliberately. He turned suddenly and found Julian standing in the doorway, arms folded, watching him with narrowed eyes. "You're not going to find anything, you know," Julian said. "My father died of natural causes. Everyone agrees." "Everyone does," said Whimsy pleasantly. "But then, everyone once agreed that the sun revolved around the earth. Consensus, my dear Julian, is a rather flimsy foundation for truth." Julian stepped into the room, jaw tight. "Is this a game to you?" "Not in the least. I detest games. They always involve rules, and rules are so frightfully easy to bend." Julian hesitated. "If you're suggesting someone killed him, then you're wasting your time." Whimsy's voice dropped. "Am I? Then perhaps you'll explain why, on the very day your father was found dead, he wrote to demand the presence of a solicitor at precisely the hour no one saw him alive." Julian's face went still. Whimsy tilted his head, studying the young man like a chess master reviewing the board. Then he smiled, bowed slightly, and said, "Well then, we shall see." And he strolled past, humming softly under his breath, as the grandfather clock struck 11 with a chime that sounded, just faintly, like a warning. It was shortly after noon when Whimsy wandered into the village, a stout walking-stick in hand and a glint of polite mischief in his eye. The lane from Marchbank's house descended between hedgerows fat with hawthorn, and Whimsy progressed at a meandering pace, pausing now and again to prod at a molehill or pass remark upon a flustered hen. Bunter, 2 paces behind and equipped with the sort of bag more often seen in the hands of a travelling chiropodist, bore the semblance of a gentleman's valet on an errand of pedestrian dignity. But one had only to observe the angle of his gaze to suspect a mind recording details with photographic precision. The post office, a damp brick building with a sullen window, exhaled a faint smell of biscuit and glue. Within, Mrs. Digby, who ran the place with a severity more suited to a tribunal, peered over her spectacles with the suspicion of one who expected the gentry to demand stamps on credit. "Morning," said Whimsy, removing his hat with a gallantry that nearly felled a rack of postcards. "I wonder if you might assist me with a modest inquiry. Lord Peter Wimsey, at your service." "I know who you are," said Mrs. Digby, in the tone of one who regretted it. "You were in the paper once. Something about a bishop's leg. A regrettable misunderstanding involving a pair of galoshes and the acoustics of Ely Cathedral. Entirely resolved, I assure you." He smiled benignly. "I'm hoping you might recall whether Colonel Marchbanks posted anything significant in the last week or two." She sniffed. "He was regular as rain, if that's what you mean. Every Thursday and Sunday, like Mass. An admirable discipline. But did he send anything out in the last day or two? Something urgent, perhaps?" Mrs. Digby pondered. "Sunday, he sent a letter to London. Special delivery. Marked it private. Came in himself, which was rare. Normally sent that mousy secretary of his." "Did he now?" murmured Wimsey. "And this was last Sunday?" "Just after service. Wore his coat, though it wasn't cold. Bit pale, now I think of it." "Did he say who it was to?" She bristled. "I don't read the Post, if that's what you're implying." "Perish the thought, but you might have noticed the address, just in passing." She considered. "Somewhere in Holborn. Lincoln's Inn, maybe. Fancy sort of envelope." "Delightful. Well, I thank you, Mrs. Digby, for your unimpeachable discretion and your clarity of recollection. Would that all the nation's postmistresses maintained so noble a standard." With a rustle of newspaper and faintly offended sniff, she retreated behind a partition. Wimsey turned to Bunter. "Holborn, Lincoln's Inn, Fanshawe, and Rick's. Very likely the same. And if that letter reached its destination before the Colonel died, I dare say it may tell us what he feared." "Shall I telephone them, my lord?" "No, Bunter. Let's have them in their natural habitat. Full morning light and an uncooperative clerk. I find the inefficiencies of a London legal office most revealing when observed in situ. Tomorrow, perhaps. For now, shall we visit the vicar?" Reverend Chiswick, whose rectory resembled a crumbling wedding cake, received Wimsey with the anxious geniality of a man used to sheep but wary of wolves. The vicarage parlour, dominated by a portrait of an apoplectic archdeacon and the smell of parsnip tea, offered few distractions. "I believe," said Wimsey, declining the offered beverage with a tragic expression, "that the Colonel was among your more regular parishioners." "Oh, yes," said Chiswick. "Sat in the fourth pew on the left, always precisely 7 minutes before the bell." "Religious conviction or social obligation?" The vicar sighed. "Difficult to say. He was not unfeeling, but his faith was military, a matter of punctuality, posture, and wrath reserved for the irreverent." Wimsey's eyes twinkled. "An Old Testament Christian, then. Not so much a Christian as a sergeant major with ecclesiastical leanings." "Delicious." He paused. "Did he ever speak of family matters? Any estrangements? Regrets?" "Nothing specific, but he was less composed these past weeks. He seemed burdened. I thought it perhaps a matter of health." "Did he speak of Julian?" The vicar hesitated. "He once asked me, quite pointedly, if redemption required confession, even of sins not actionable by law. He phrased it oddly, as though considering someone else's soul." "Indeed." Wimsey leaned back, tapping his lip. "And did you answer in the affirmative?" "Of course." "But he didn't pursue it." Wimsey stood. "You've been immensely helpful, Vicar, and if it comes to pass that the Colonel was shouldering a ghost, I shall endeavour to exorcise it without scandalizing the vestry." They stepped out into the churchyard, where rows of slanting gravestones crouched like gossiping crones. Wimsey paused beside a yew tree and surveyed the landscape, brows knitting. "Bunter," he said, "do you remember what Julian said yesterday about his father dying of natural causes?" "Yes, my lord," with some vehemence. "It struck me oddly at the time. Not that he said it, but the way he rushed to frame it as a matter already settled. Most people faced with sudden death in the family display uncertainty. Shock, doubt, He was too conclusive. You think he had prior knowledge? Possibly. Or a guilty conscience. Not necessarily criminal guilt, mind, but the sort that festers under shared silence. As they turned back toward the house, a figure emerged from the trees lining the drive. A slight woman in a navy coat and gloves, far too warm for the weather. She moved hesitantly, as though unsure whether to turn back. "Excuse me," she said as they approached. "Are you Lord Peter Wimsey?" Wimsey doffed his hat. "In most circles, yes. May I offer my name in return?" "Cecily Brangwen. I used to know Colonel Marchbanks, years ago. I only heard yesterday he had died." "Indeed. You knew him well?" "I was engaged to him. Briefly. In 21, before his second marriage." She looked down. It ended badly. Not through his fault, or perhaps entirely through his fault. It's hard to explain. Wimsey tilted his head. "Forgive me, Miss Brangwen, but what brings you here now?" "I received a letter," she said. "2 days ago, written by him, dated last week. It was brief. It said, 'If anything should happen to me, please speak to Lord Peter Wimsey. He will understand.'" There was a pause in which even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Wimsey took the letter she produced, scanning it rapidly. The handwriting was unmistakably the Colonel's. The words, few though they were, bore the taut, compressed weight of a man sealing an envelope with more than wax. "He didn't explain?" "No, only that. I didn't even know he had enemies." "Oh, Miss Brangwen," murmured Wimsey, folding the letter with delicate precision. "In country houses such as these, the enemies are rarely distant. They tend to live just down the corridor." She looked up at him, eyes wide. "Do you think he was afraid?" "I think," said Wimsey, "that he had finally realized the most dangerous ghosts are not those that haunt old corridors, but those that whisper from letters, from secrets, from the cracks in a polished floorboard. And I intend," he added quietly, "to hear every last whisper." And with that, he offered Miss Brangwen his arm, and together they walked back up the drive, beneath trees that shivered in a breeze not entirely of the wind's making. They reached the house just as the kitchen bell was chiming a querulous note that suggested someone below stairs had mistaken the concept of luncheon for an act of civil disobedience. Cecily Brangwen walked with a stiffness not born of age. Wimsey noted the clench of her gloved fingers, the too steady pace of a woman accustomed to rehearsed calm. Once inside, he directed her not to the drawing room, but to the smaller morning parlor, quieter, sunnier, and less prone to being overheard through keyholes. Bunter, having deposited his valise and made a discreet note of the pattern of muddy footprints in the hallway, one pair smaller, pointing outwards, another larger, slightly smudged and returning, vanished on the pretext of fetching tea. Wimsey waved Miss Brangwen to a chair beside the window and seated himself opposite with the easy grace of a man prepared to wait all afternoon for the precise inflection of a single phrase. "You were engaged to the Colonel, you said," he began, "in 1921. That would have been before his second marriage to Miss Alice Cartwright, yes?" She nodded. "Shortly before. I left him." "Ah," he said it without pressure. "And may I be so indelicate as to ask why?" She looked at him with a cool, clear steadiness. "Because he frightened me." "Frightened," Wimsey echoed gently. "Not physically. Not then. He was precise, scrupulous, even in affection, but cold. He wanted a companion, not a partner. Everything had its place, my laugh, my dress, even my future opinions. I saw how he'd arranged his world like a military map, and I realized I'd be expected to march through it like a well-drilled company. I was 27. I wanted—" She broke off, then smiled faintly. "It sounds ridiculous now. It sounds very sensible. The Colonel, I think, was a man made uneasy by variables. Did he take it badly?" "He was angry," she said after a pause. He didn't show it in public, of course, but I had the sense, foolish perhaps, that he didn't just feel wounded. He felt thwarted. I moved to Shropshire soon after. We never spoke again. And yet, 24 years later, he wrote to you. That's what frightened me. I hadn't heard from him in decades. Then suddenly this note. No explanation, no apology, not even an address. Just your name and a vague implication that something dreadful might occur. What could he possibly have meant? Whimsy tapped a long finger against his knee. It may not have been meant for you alone. You think he sent others. I think, he said thoughtfully. The Colonel knew his life was arranged too tidily for anyone to suspect murder, and that he might be believed only by someone who once refused to live in the tidy little world he built. Before she could respond, the door opened and Julian Marchbanks entered without knocking, eyes flickering immediately to Cicely. He stopped short. "Oh," he said. "Forgive me. I didn't realize we had guests." Miss Brangwyn rose. "I should go." "Not on my account," Julian replied with an edge. "I assume you were invited." "I was summoned, more or less," she said coolly. Whimsy interjected lightly. "Miss Brangwyn received a rather curious letter from your late father, Julian, dated before his death. It mentioned me. I thought it best we discuss it here." Julian's jaw shifted. My father had a tendency toward melodrama. "Did he?" Whimsy said. "That doesn't quite tally with the man others describe." Julian ignored the comment and turned to Cicely. "You left him once. Why come back now?" Cicely met his gaze evenly. "Because the man I left didn't seem afraid of dying." There was a silence. Then Julian muttered, "Well, if you're looking for ghosts, you'll find them aplenty in this house, but none that'll speak." He turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. "Well," Whimsy murmured after a moment, "I do believe someone's nerves are beginning to fray at the edges." Cicely exhaled slowly. "He resents me. I can feel it." "Quite possibly. But resentment's an old hat in country houses. What matters is whether he resents you enough to have hoped you wouldn't receive that letter." "You don't trust him?" "I don't trust anyone," Whimsy said brightly. "Not even Bunter. I have it on good authority he once substituted Glenlivet for Lafroge at a house party in Wiltshire and tried to pass it off as patriotic discretion. Bunter returned just then with a tea tray and did not so much as twitch. Whimsy poured for them both, added 1 sugar to Cecily's without asking, and resumed in a tone of delicate inquiry. "You were fond of him once. The Colonel, I mean. Did he seem the kind of man to leave things unfinished?" She considered. "No, that's what disturbed me about the letter. It suggested something untidy. He hated that." "Then we must ask ourselves," said Whimsy, placing his cup down precisely, "what made him feel suddenly disordered? What secret, what threat could prompt a man so tidy to reach into the past for a voice he'd once tried to silence?" He rose. "Miss Brangwyn, I suggest you remain nearby for now. There may be more to uncover, and I rather suspect your name will surface again, perhaps not in any comfortable way." After she had gone, Bunter cleared his throat in a manner that suggested a wealth of suppressed commentary. "Yes, Bunter, I took the liberty of examining the Colonel's correspondence box, my lord. Locked, of course, but Miss Fellows allowed me to inspect the surrounding drawers." "Miss Fellows," Whimsy mused. "Not quite as prim as she pretends, perhaps." "I would not presume, my lord. However, I found a burned scrap in the grate of the Colonel's study, half of an envelope, postmarked Holborn. The address appears to match that of Fanshawe and Ricks." "Ah, the Sunday letter. So it was indeed posted. Curious." "More curious, my lord, is the fact that the burnt envelope was found inside the house. The Colonel presumably retained it after sending the letter. Or he burned a copy, meaning he feared it might fall into the wrong hands." Whimsy's brows rose. "So he sends a confidential letter to his solicitor, and days later he is found dead of heart failure that nobody expected." "Exactly so, my lord." They walked then, quietly, down the corridor toward the Colonel's study. The door stood half ajar. Whimsy paused before entering, listening. Within, someone was rifling through drawers. He raised a finger, motioning Bunter to silence. In 2 swift strides he was at the threshold, the door swinging open with a theatrical creak that must have delighted some ghost of English melodrama. Inside, crouched at the desk, Julian Marchbanks looked up, a bundle of papers in hand, and an expression that suggested he had either been caught burgling a bank or rehearsing amateur dramatics. Possibly both. "Looking for the family crest?" asked Whimsy sweetly. "Or just brushing up on dear Papa's will?" Julian stood sharply. "This is still my house." "Which makes it all the odder you'd wait until others were distracted to go rummaging." Julian's jaw tightened. "I thought there might be something personal, something he meant for me." "Of course. That must be it." Whimsy moved closer. "Would you mind if I had a look?" Julian hesitated. Then, almost defiantly, he handed over the papers. Whimsy glanced through them. A set of invoices, mostly. Garden upkeep, books ordered from Hatchard's, a peculiar note about a French clock in need of silent calibration. He paused, tapped the last entry. "Now why," he said softly, "would a man need a clock silenced?" Julian said nothing. Whimsy smiled, folded the paper, and pocketed it. "Thank you, Julian. Do let me know if you stumble across anything else alarmingly mundane." He turned, leaving the room with Bunter close behind. Invoices, Bunter, domestic trivia. But somewhere amid the rhododendron trimmings and horological peculiarities, I do believe we are closing in on something unspeakably human. Bunter nodded. "Shall I contact the solicitors, my lord?" "Do. And fetch me the housekeeper's rota while you're at it. I want to know exactly who was awake between midnight and dawn on the night the Colonel died, and whether any of them ever stopped to hear a clock that should not have chimed." It was 4:30 when the light began to thin along the corniced ceiling of the east corridor, dimming the portrait of the Colonel's grandfather, a man whose mutton chops resembled ecclesiastical tassels and whose expression implied an unfortunate encounter with Parliament. Whimsy, standing in the liminal hush outside the butler's pantry, was reading the housekeeper's rota with all the concentration of a man decrypting a military cipher. The list was exhaustive. Mrs. Hope, the housekeeper, recorded her staff's movements with monastic zeal. Breakfast trays laid at 6:45 sharp, curtains drawn at 7:08, fires lit no later than 7:20, and on Thursdays, a peculiar note, tins polished, scullery to remain locked overnight. Whimsy found this curious, though in truth he'd always felt polishing tins at dawn possessed a faintly devotional quality. His gaze drifted to the midnight entries. The rota showed 2 names against the early hours on the night of the Colonel's death. Dorothy, under housemaid, for 3:30 a.m. Stoking duty, and Miss Fellows, the secretary, who had apparently remained up late transcribing dictated letters. Whimsy had already examined the letters. They included an unfinished note to Fanshawe and Ricks, interrupted mid-sentence by a sudden scratch of the pen, as though the Colonel had been interrupted or had ceased to find the words worth finishing. "Bunter," Whimsy said presently, "what's your feeling on the nocturnal habits of under-housemaids?" "I generally avoid speculating on the private conduct of domestics, my lord. But if you were to speculate?" Bunter allowed himself the faintest cough. "I believe Miss Dorothy is of the type inclined to smoke hand-rolled cigarettes when unsupervised and to replace candlesticks an inch askew." "A reprobate, then. Let us find her at once." They located Dorothy in the boot room, polishing laces with an unconvincing appearance of diligence. She was young, 19 or so, with red, perpetually surprised eyebrows and the disheveled air of one who had been caught whispering by doorways all her life. "Miss Dorothy," said Whimsy kindly, "I was wondering if you might help me understand the architecture of insomnia in this house." She stared. "Sir, you were up stoking fires on the night the Colonel died. Around 3:30? Yes, sir. Always do Tuesdays and Fridays. Furnace is temperamental. And did you observe anything untoward? A light on where it shouldn't have been? A door ajar that is usually shut with military fastidiousness? She hesitated. I did hear something. Whimsy's expression remained pleasantly vague. Do go on. Well, sir, I was in the lower corridor past the morning room and I heard a clock strike. 4 chimes. But not the main hall clock, it was different. Higher pitched, like the French one in the Colonel's study. Whimsy's brows twitched. That's odd. I was under the impression that clock no longer chimed. She looked flustered. That's what Mrs. Hope says. Been muffled since 41, too noisy for the Colonel's nerves. And yet you're quite sure you heard it? Oh, yes. Gave me a turn, it did. Thought I'd imagined it until I looked up and saw a light coming from under the study door. Did you look in? No, sir. She looked scandalized. Wouldn't dare, but I thought maybe Miss Fellows was still working. And was she? She came down 5 minutes later from upstairs. She looked pale. Whimsy tucked his hands behind his back and said nothing for a long moment. Then, thank you, Dorothy. That has been most enlightening. Do continue to punish those boots with the full weight of your moral indignation. He stepped away, motioning Bunter with him. Miss Fellows, he murmured as they ascended the staircase, has a curious relationship with veracity. She stated she retired at 2, my lord. Exactly. Yet our diligent Dorothy places her descending the stairs at 3:35. Pale and unsupervised, and I dare say the French clock does not chime unprovoked. He paused as they reached the upper landing. The Colonel's study lay in shadows now, its door closed but not locked. Whimsy opened it and crossed to the fireplace. The French clock on the mantelpiece sat precisely in the center, its enamel dial obscured beneath an etched glass dome. He lifted it carefully, examining the base. A small felt disc had been removed. Well, he said, that explains the chiming. Someone re-enabled it. Would that suggest the Colonel heard it that night? More to the point, Bunter, it suggests someone wanted him too. The sound might have been jarring to a man with a heart condition, especially if he was already tense. He straightened and moved to the bureau. Let's suppose Miss Fellows didn't merely descend the stairs. Let's suppose she came into the study, to retrieve something perhaps, or, just possibly, to replace it. Forged documents, or destroyed ones. But what troubles me, Bunter, is not what she may have taken, but what she left. Bunter blinked. The letter? Possibly. But more than that, the timing. If the Colonel heard the chime, then shortly after Miss Fellows came downstairs and saw him, then why did she say she retired hours before? To conceal the visit. Indeed. Which suggests she was either doing something she oughtn't or saw something she shouldn't. They found Miss Fellows in the sunroom, seated with needlepoint and an expression that suggested murder would be preferable to any conversation involving parlor games. Miss Fellows, said Whimsy brightly, I wonder if you'd indulge me with a small correction. You mentioned earlier that you retired at 2 o'clock on the night of the Colonel's death. But we have testimony placing you on the stairs at 3:35. Her needle paused mid-stitch. I don't know who said that. An observant under housemaid, said Whimsy pleasantly. And rather more to the point, the Colonel's study clock appears to have chimed at 4, which suggests it had been reactivated by someone who knew where the muffling pad was kept. Silence. I returned for my fountain pen, she said at last. I'd left it in the study. The Colonel wasn't there when I entered. I thought he might have gone to bed. Yet he was found in that very room only hours later, dead. I swear he wasn't there. Very well, said Whimsy. Then let me ask, did you notice anything missing from his desk? Papers, a note, an envelope? She hesitated. No. Whimsy smiled gently. I think you did. But you feared that to admit it would cast suspicion, or that the letter might implicate you. Let me put your mind at ease. I already know what the letter said." Her eyes flew to his. "You forget," he murmured. The Colonel made a habit of redundancy. "A copy, Miss Fellows. He posted one to Fanshawe and Ricks. And what it reveals is not a murderer in the obvious sense, but someone who wanted the appearance of natural death so very badly that they neglected to consider who else might be watching the clocks." He rose. "You will tell me what you removed, now or later, when it becomes a matter for the coroner's inquiry." Miss Fellows folded her hands tightly. Then she said, "It was a page, torn from his diary. He'd written something. I didn't want it seen." "What did it say?" "He wrote, 'It is her. The past come calling. The drawing-room window was open again tonight, just as before.'" Whimsy's gaze sharpened. "That window, did anyone else have access?" "Only him, and the housekeeper." "Then I think we must speak to Mrs. Hope, and perhaps, we are ready to reconsider who was meant to find that letter, and who knew, even before it was sent, that it might cost them everything." The light was gone entirely from the east windows now, and a thin rain had begun to fall, a quiet, persistent tapping against the leaded panes of the drawing-room, as though the house itself were trying to eavesdrop. Lord Peter stood once more in the Colonel's study, his silhouette slightly bowed beneath the carved mantel, fingers tracing the grooves of the now silent French clock. Behind him, Bunter was engaged in a delicate inspection of the floorboards beneath the escritoire, using a brass-handled torch and the respectful care one might grant a tomb relic. Neither man spoke for some moments. Whimsy appeared to be thinking along lines not immediately adjacent to the present surroundings. At last he said, "You know, Bunter, what most puzzles me in this business is not how the Colonel died, but when he truly became afraid." Bunter, without looking up, replied, "The diary entry suggests some prior disturbance, my lord." "Indeed, just as before," which implies repetition. The open window, the drawing-room, he associates something in that room with menace, though he says nothing explicit. And yet he left no instruction to secure it. Perhaps he feared ridicule. Perhaps. Or perhaps he was not afraid for his life, but for his reputation. There is a difference, and it's a difference of social consequence. A colonel can admit fear of an assassin far more easily than fear of scandal. There was a tap at the door, and a moment later, Mrs. Hope entered, clasping a handkerchief with the resolute decorum of a woman who has managed to run a household through both influenza and the general strike, without losing her grip on either silverware or staff. "You wish to speak with me, my lord?" "Ah, Mrs. Hope. Yes. I'm trying to make sense of the Colonel's recent preoccupations. It appears he was unsettled. You've been with the family many years, I believe." "Since before the first Mrs. Delgard died, sir." "And in all that time, did you ever know the Colonel to fear someone or something from his past?" She drew herself up. "The Colonel was not a fanciful man, my lord." "Fanciful, no, but methodical, and, I suspect, not immune to remorse." Mrs. Hope said nothing, but her gaze flicked momentarily toward the portrait of the Colonel above the fireplace. "Mrs. Hope," Whimsy continued, in a tone at once lighter and more pointed, "on the night of his death, the drawing-room window was open. Dorothy claims she shut it at dusk as per your usual instructions. She did. And yet it was open again just before dawn. Did the Colonel often open it himself?" "No, sir." "Then someone else did, after the room was set for the night." Mrs. Hope hesitated. Then, after a glance behind her, she shut the study door with a quiet finality. "There was someone who used to come," she said. "A visitor, late at night. Never through the front door. The Colonel never wanted anyone to know." "Go on." "A woman. I never saw her face clearly, but she was small, wore a dark cape, always hooded. She came twice that I know of, and each time through the drawing-room window. The Colonel would be waiting there. They never stayed long." "When was this?" The first time was just after Michaelmas last year. The second time, a week before he died. Whimsy whistled softly. A clandestine assignation? How operatic. And yet he never spoke of it. No, sir. And you didn't recognize her? Mrs. Hope pressed her lips together. I thought I might. Once. Her walk was familiar, but I said nothing. It wasn't my place. Was she ever seen by anyone else? I couldn't say. Whimsy inclined his head gravely. You've been most helpful, Mrs. Hope, and indiscreet in just the right measure. She gave him a faintly affronted nod and withdrew, leaving the room with the finality of a closing ledger. Bunter stood. Shall I make inquiries, my lord? Discreet ones. About the hooded lady? Yes. Begin with the parish registers. I suspect we're dealing with someone who has never quite left, even if her name no longer appears on the invitations list. They moved next to the drawing room, where the fireplace was cold, and the scent of old rosewood lingered beneath the faint, bitter tang of extinguished candle wax. Whimsy examined the window. The lock was old-fashioned, easily jimmied, but there were scratch marks along the sill. Fresh ones. Recently reopened, he said. There's wax on the curtain hem, Bunter added. Red. Someone with a dripping candle who didn't expect to be seen. Whimsy crouched, sniffed at the wax, then straightened. A visitor, then. Possibly the same one as before, or someone revisiting their method. As they turned to leave, Whimsy paused beside the escritoire. He opened a drawer, removed a blotter sheet, and held it to the light. Nothing overt, he muttered. But look here. Indentations. He took out a soft pencil and lightly rubbed the paper. 2 words emerged. She knows. He smiled without mirth. My dear Colonel, you left us breadcrumbs after all. Outside the drawing room, the corridor was darker than before, and the sound of voices filtered down from upstairs. Whimsy turned in time to see Annabel Delgard descending with the slightly theatrical grace of one who suspects herself to be watched. Her expression was cool. More interrogations, Lord Peter? Merely flirtations with the past, Lady Delgard. I should think the past has no bearing here. Edwin's death was natural. The doctor said so. And yet, said Whimsy mildly, there are natural deaths, and there are conveniently timed ones. Your late husband feared something, Lady Delgard. He wrote about it in his diary. She faltered slightly. He kept no diary. Indeed he did, torn pages notwithstanding. Her expression hardened. Are you accusing me of something? I'm simply pointing out that you stand to inherit a considerable amount, and that your husband was on the verge of altering his will. That did it. Her face went white. You know about that? I do. The letter to his solicitors was never posted, but a copy exists. He intended to leave a portion of the estate to someone else. Her hands clenched. That woman. Which woman, Lady Delgard? But she turned abruptly, walking away without answering. Whimsy watched her go. That, Bunter, he said quietly, is a woman who has realized she is not the only ghost in the house. And what now, my lord? Now we pay a visit to Fanshawe and Ricks. I want to know who else was mentioned in that letter, and then we find out who left footprints in the garden beneath the drawing-room sill. And if there are none? Oh, there will be. You cannot enter or leave a house without leaving some impression. The only question is whether it is physical or psychological. He turned on his heel, his voice light, but his eyes grave. Some truths are buried with the dead, Bunter, but this one, I think, is still pacing the corridors, and I mean to catch her before she disappears again into the night. The solicitor's office, nestled above the fishmonger's and flanked by a chiropodist's window bearing the faded decal of a once hopeful swan, was as discreetly English as a stiff upper lip. Inside, Fanshawe and Ricks smelt of red tape, old vellum, and pipe smoke. Not the sort of place where men murdered, but certainly one where they quietly ensured their rivals did not prosper. Lord Peter Wimsey was ushered into a narrow room lined with ledgers that seemed to breathe dusty disapproval. Mr. Ricks, junior partner and elder by temperament, sat behind a desk like a caricature of an undertaker denied the pleasure of black gloves. His expression upon recognizing Wimsey did not shift beyond the standard 10 degrees of legal concern. "You are investigating the matter of Colonel Delgard's death, Lord Peter." "I am, Mr. Ricks, and I trust it will prove a matter of dull natural causes in the end. But alas, dullness evades me. I've a few questions about a letter the Colonel wrote, though apparently never posted." Ricks steepled his fingers. "I assume you are referring to the revised instructions regarding his will." "I am indeed. The original, as I understand it, leaves everything to Lady Delgard, but the revised draft was never formalized," said Ricks with that peculiar lawyer's emphasis that implies both authority and irrelevance. However, the Colonel had instructed us to include a bequest of considerable size to one Miss Marguerite Blaine. "Marguerite Blaine," Wimsey repeated, as if it were a line of poetry he half remembered. "The name evokes faint scent of faded satin. And who, may I ask, is Miss Blaine?" "Once a companion to the Colonel's first wife some 20 years ago. After the first Lady Delgard's passing, Miss Blaine left the household. There was a degree of unpleasantness." "Financial?" "No," said Ricks, shifting slightly. "Emotional. The Colonel's affections, shall we say, strayed. Lady Delgard was ill for some time. Miss Blaine was young. Matters became untenable." Wimsey raised an eyebrow, and yet, all these years later, he reintroduces her into his financial testament. Why? I am not a psychologist, Lord Peter. But you are a witness to the affairs of men, Mr. Ricks. Was this merely conscience? Some late-blooming remorse? I cannot say, but the Colonel's instructions were clear. Miss Blaine was to receive the sum of £4,000. His wife was not informed. "Indeed not," murmured Wimsey. "And where is Miss Blaine now?" "She resides in a small cottage in Lower Gilead, some 5 miles out. She has lived there quietly since the war. Never married." Wimsey stood, tugging at the cuff of his glove. "Thank you, Mr. Ricks. I'm beginning to suspect that the Colonel's final act was not merely one of legal tidying, but a sort of moral bookkeeping." He left the office with Bunter at his heels, and they turned toward the motor, parked discreetly beside a hedge that had ambitions toward topiary, but lacked discipline. "Lower Gilead, Bunter, and see if the thermos has anything resembling coffee in it. I feel we are approaching the heart of the matter, and I should like to be properly fortified before plunging in." The road to Lower Gilead curved through a landscape that had once been mapped by monks and later by officers planning troop movements. The rain, a soft, incessant drizzle now, gave the hedgerows a peculiar gleam, as though the countryside itself were holding its breath. Miss Blaine's cottage proved to be a square, slate-roofed affair with latticed windows and a front garden of stubborn, tangled roses. She opened the door herself. A woman of late middle years, she had that delicately preserved look of someone who had once been beautiful and now merely startled people by being still present. Her eyes, pale as water over gravel, met Wimsey's with something like expectation. "Yes? Forgive the intrusion, Miss Blaine. Lord Peter Wimsey. I believe you knew Colonel Delgard." Her fingers twitched against the doorframe. "You'd better come in." The parlor was sparsely furnished, but spotlessly clean. An embroidery frame stood by the window, a tea tray untouched on the sideboard. A fire struggled in the grate. "You've come about Edwin." "I have. I thought perhaps you would. I expected someone at any rate. He never did anything halfway." Wimsey took the armchair she offered and declined the tea with a graceful flick of his fingers. "You saw him recently?" Her hands twisted in her lap. "He came to see me about 3 weeks ago. Said he wanted to make things right." "Had things been wrong for a long time?" She smiled, not with humor, but with resignation. "They were never quite right. He loved me once, or thought he did. Then he stayed with Helen, Because of duty, because of illness, because of appearances. I was dismissed. Quietly. There was no scandal, of course. There never is, if the man is careful and the woman has no money. And yet he sought you out again, after all this time. He said he wanted to leave me something. A little recognition, he called it. I told him I didn't want his guilt money, but I suppose part of me hoped. Did he mention fear? Her gaze sharpened. Fear? No, not exactly. But he was nervous, unsettled, as though someone were watching him. He kept glancing out the window. Did you go to the manor? She hesitated. Only once. He asked me to come after dark. He didn't want Helen or the servants to know. I thought it foolish, but I agreed. You entered by the drawing-room window? Yes. Why? He said it was the only room he could secure without arousing suspicion, and it was like old times. He poured a drink. We talked. Did he mention anyone else? A threat? No. But he said he felt time was against him, that something was closing in. It was unlike him. And then he died. Yes. Whimsy rose. Thank you, Miss Blaine. You have given me more than you know. She looked up, a flicker of pain behind her composure. Do you think someone killed him? I think, said Whimsy, that someone feared what his change of heart might unleash. They drove back in silence, the countryside now swallowed by fog. Whimsy stared ahead, brows knit. Bunter, he said suddenly, do you recall what Dorothy said? About the carpet in the drawing-room? She said she always vacuums it clockwise, my lord. Indeed. But the colonel's scuff marks were against the grain. He had been pacing, not just standing, and the wax was nearer the window than the decanter. I think he opened the window again, after she left, and someone else came in. Bunter nodded. The second visitor. Yes, but this one didn't come to forgive, or to be forgiven. He leaned back, the rain thudding now in earnest against the windscreen. I believe, Bunter, that the key to all this lies in what wasn't said, in the silences, the torn diary page, the phrase, she knows. What if Miss Blaine wasn't the only woman with a secret to keep? What if someone else feared exposure, not of murder, but of something more subtle, something socially fatal? Lady Delgard, or Annabel, or someone entirely elsewhere, but whoever it is, they watched that drawing-room, waited, and when the colonel decided to make amends, they struck, not for vengeance, but for preservation. The fog rolled thicker, and Whimsy's eyes gleamed. Tomorrow, Bunter, we speak with Dorothy again. She saw something that morning, something she thinks irrelevant, but nothing is irrelevant in a house where the past walks more freely than the living. The next morning dawned with the sun reluctant to commit, pressing pale and uncertain through gauze-like clouds that hung low over the hedgerows. It cast a bleached light upon the manor, turning its grey stones into the colour of old parchment and drawing long, solemn shadows across the garden. Lord Peter Whimsy, shaved, brushed and fortified with black coffee, returned to the scene with the briskness of a man about to indulge a suspicion rather than merely test a theory. Dorothy, the maid, greeted him at the side door, blinking in the cold. You said you wanted to ask me again, my lord? If you can endure a few more minutes of impertinence, Dorothy. Yes. He led her back into the drawing-room, where the memory of death still seemed to linger faintly, like the last movement of a symphony that refused to fade. You mentioned that you entered this room on the morning of the colonel's death to draw the curtains. Yes, my lord. And you said the carpet had odd marks, scuffs that went against your usual vacuuming? That's right. And I don't mind saying, it gave me a turn. The colonel was always fastidious. That carpet might as well have been sacred. Whimsy smiled faintly. Quite. Now then, when you entered the room that morning, what was the very first thing you noticed? The curtains, sir. They were only half drawn. Odd again. The colonel never left them so. Did they appear to have been tampered with? Tugged? Not tugged exactly. Just left. as if someone had been looking out but hadn't bothered to finish the job. And the window? Dorothy hesitated, brow furrowed. It was latched. I remember that now. But there was a little smudge on the sill, like someone's finger had pressed against the frame. "Ah," said Whimsy. "And tell me, did you notice anything missing?" "Missing, my lord." He motioned gently to the sideboard. "Something usually kept here that wasn't?" Dorothy's eyes widened. "Yes, well, yes. There's always a small silver salver, used for the post. But I didn't see it that morning." "Indeed. And you didn't mention this before?" "I didn't think it mattered, sir. I thought perhaps Cook had taken it to polish." "Thank you, Dorothy. That's remarkably helpful." Or excused himself with a graceful nod and returned to the hallway, where Bunter awaited like a particularly discerning shadow. "Bunter," he said softly, "locate the salver. I've an odd feeling it's become an accomplice." "Very good, my lord." While Bunter vanished into the nether regions of domestic storage, Whimsy took to pacing the drawing-room himself. The wax stain remained, obstinately near the window, as though the candle had been placed there during a moment of private dread. He knelt, inspecting the grain of the carpet. The scuff marks led not just to the window, but, curiously, to the bookcase. He frowned. Nothing about the case suggested hidden compartments or theatrical twists, but still— "Excuse me, my lord." It was Bunter, reappearing with triumph only faintly disguised. "I found the salver, buried at the back of a linen cupboard under some seasonal tea cozies." "Remarkable instincts, Bunter. Does it bear anything of interest?" "It does, my lord. 2 faint smudges, one resembling wax and another darker, possibly ink or soot. And, if I'm not mistaken, a few glimmering threads of dark green wool caught along the edge." Whimsy straightened, his gaze sharpening like a fencer readying a lunge. "Dark green," he repeated, "like Lady Delgard's winter shawl." "Precisely, my lord." He exhaled slowly. "Then we must speak with her ladyship again, but not here. Invite her discreetly to the conservatory. The dead are bad company for confession." Lady Delgard received the summons with the glacial composure of a woman long trained in the art of appearing unflustered. She arrived swathed in that same dark green shawl, though now it seemed less like fashion and more like concealment. Whimsy, ever courteous, gestured toward a wrought iron seat beneath a drooping bougainvillea. "My lady," he began lightly, "you strike me as a woman who understands precisely how much one can get away with, provided one never steps outside the drawing-room tone." She raised an eyebrow. "Is this a prelude to accusation, Lord Peter?" "Not at all. Merely context. I'm curious about the evening before your husband died. You claimed you were reading." "I was." "And the window, did you open it during the night?" "I did not. It was bitterly cold. Yet there is evidence someone did, after Miss Blaine left." Her expression didn't flicker. "I don't see how that concerns me." "Because," said Whimsy, "the person who came in through that window after Miss Blaine's clandestine departure was not an outsider. There was no forced entry, no footprints across the frost. The window was opened from within. The intruder knew the layout, the habits, the exact hour the house would fall silent, and above all, they knew the colonel had rewritten his will." Something trembled in her jaw. Barely. A tick, perhaps, or something trying not to become a sob. "Lady Delgard, your husband, intended to leave a substantial sum to a woman you considered beneath contempt. That might not have threatened your financial standing, but socially it would have whispered scandal. Old scandal, yes, but in the genteel countryside, scandal ages like blue cheese. It never vanishes. It only intensifies." "You think I killed him?" "I think," said Whimsy gently, "you stopped him." There was silence in the conservatory then, broken only by the tentative rustle of leaves. "I didn't mean to," she said at last. He was being absurd, dramatic. He kept talking about his conscience, how he'd lived too long with regret. As though I hadn't. What happened? I confronted him. I told him it was ridiculous, that he'd ruin us both. He said he'd already posted the letter to Rick's, that it was done. I lost my temper. Whimsy's voice softened. And the candle. He tried to calm me. Lit the candle. He always did that when he wanted to pacify me. Said it reminded him of stillness. God help me, I struck him. Not hard, not to kill. He fell. The wax spilled near the window, and I panicked. I tried to put everything back. I wiped the salver. He'd used it for his post again, out of habit. It had the wax from the candle. I didn't think it would matter. You replaced the letter with the old will? No, there was no letter. I discovered later, it was still in his desk. Unsent. He lied. He hadn't posted it after all. Whimsy rose, his expression unreadable. Lady Delgard, the law may see degrees in action, but I suspect it will not trouble itself with motive once the facts are arranged. She said nothing, merely gripped the shawl more tightly around her shoulders. He bowed. I must ask you to remain within reach of the authorities. There will be inquiries. As he returned to the motor car where Bunter waited, a light snow had begun to fall, graceful, reticent, as though the sky itself were ashamed of such theatrical timing. Well, Bunter, Whimsy murmured, there are worse things than ghosts, it seems. Regret, for instance. Or memory. Indeed, my lord. And tomorrow we must visit Miss Blaine again. There's one page still missing from that diary, and I think it may hold the key to what the Colonel feared most. Not exposure, not shame, but being forgotten entirely. Whimsy did not return directly to Miss Blaine that afternoon, but instead drove first to the village post office, a red-bricked relic whose brass fittings had long since dulled into dull righteousness. Its mistress, a woman called Mrs. Lapping, who bore the curious resemblance of someone perpetually interrupting herself mid-thought, remembered Lord Delgard's final visit with the precision of one who regarded such rare appearances as ecclesiastical events. Posted a packet, he did, she confirmed, nodding towards the ledger. Special delivery. Said it was urgent. Paid, extra too, and he was never one for extravagance unless it was a hunting dog or a Madeira. And this was when? Evening of the 6th, about 4:30, just before closing. In fact, I nearly said no, but there's something about the Colonel made you think twice about refusing. And the name of the recipient? Barrister in London, a Mr. Ricks. Used to handle his estate matters, I believe. Whimsy allowed himself the most infinitesimal of smiles. Thank you, Mrs. Lapping. You've cleared up a most awkward knot. He was silent on the return journey, drumming his fingers along the inside of the Bentley, while Bunter navigated the rutted lanes with the patience of a man born into both fog and inevitability. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and a wind that carried the damp breath of thawed frost. Whimsy's mind moved faster than the wheels, catching at threads he had teased for days, but only now began to knot together. When he arrived again at Ivy Lodge, Miss Blaine answered the door herself. Her face, usually so pale as to border on translucent, now carried a tint of pink. Surprise, perhaps, or the suspicion of unfinished confession. I hoped you'd come, she said, with a smile that was not wholly untroubled. Whimsy inclined his head. My dear Miss Blaine, when an innocent woman burns pages from a diary, one must assume either guilt or sacrifice. She ushered him in, and he settled by the hearth once more, his long limbs folding in an angular fashion, like an origami gentleman arranged by a nervous hand. I found the missing page, she said quietly, and handed him a folded scrap from the pocket of her cardigan. I couldn't bring myself to destroy it after all, but I daren't show the police, not without knowing what it meant. Whimsy unfolded the paper with care. It was not torn from the book, but written separately in a tighter hand and far more deliberate than the earlier entries. He read it once and again. Then he looked up, the expression in his blue eyes unreadable. "So he meant it," he murmured. "He truly meant it." Miss Blaine's voice trembled. "You see now why I lied." "Yes, but what I do not yet see is whether you realize why he wrote it." She sat across from him, as if awaiting judgment in a drawing-room fashioned like a courtroom, where all the witnesses were memory and every chair a jury box. "He wanted to make it right," she said at last. "He never said so, not directly. But there were moments, quiet ones, when he looked at me as though I reminded him of everything he'd buried." "More than affection," said Whimsy, tapping the paper. "Remorse. Not merely the sin, but the decades spent armored against its consequences, to protect a name. He said once, only once, that people remember shame longer than kindness, that if he died suddenly, he wanted at least one thing to be his, unhidden. That's why he made the change to the will and the letter to Mr. Ricks. I didn't know he'd posted it. I thought he was bluffing again. He was always bluffing, always trying to keep control of everything, everyone. Until the end." She nodded. "May I read this aloud?" he asked gently. She inclined her head. Whimsy read, "To bequeath is not to undo, but it is the only confession society tolerates from a man like me. If this reaches Ricks, it must be taken as my true intention to amend the will in favor of Eleanor Blaine. The earlier document serves only silence. This serves reparation." Whimsy folded the page slowly. "He posted this the day he died. It will arrive, I expect, in Ricks's hands tomorrow. And then the law must decide whether intention, written and posted, trumps ink and witness. It is not a simple matter, but more interesting still," he added, "is that Lady Delgard never knew this page existed." Miss Blaine looked up sharply. "She believed I was in the will?" "No, worse. She believed the letter hadn't been sent, that she'd stopped him before it left his hands." There was a long pause. Then Miss Blaine's voice emerged, a whisper. Then she thought she was safe. "She did," said Whimsy, "but she was always 2 steps behind him. The Colonel was, despite everything, a strategist, perhaps a poor father, a worse husband, but not without clarity. He knew precisely who would stop him, and how." Miss Blaine trembled. "You mean he allowed himself to die? Not consciously, perhaps, but symbolically, yes. He left the candle, he left the window unlatched, and he waited for her to come. He lit the wick not to see, but to draw her, and he had already posted the letter." She buried her face in her hands. Whimsy stood and placed the folded paper gently on the table between them. "Miss Blaine, I believe you've endured more punishment than most who have committed crimes. And as for the law, well, it will see motive, opportunity, and fingerprints, but it will not see what that letter truly meant. You'll give it to the police? I shall give it to Ricks. Let the courts decide what is testament and what is a man's dying wish." He bowed and made to leave. At the door, he turned. "One last question, Miss Blaine. Why did you write this page out separately instead of leaving it in the diary?" Her voice was faint. "Because the diary was the past. But this felt like the future, or what might have been." As the door shut behind him, Whimsy stood for a long moment in the mist, listening to the wind move across the downs with the sound of fabric tearing. He lit a cigarette and stared at the grey horizon, which revealed nothing. When he returned to the manor that evening, the police were readying their formal charges. Lady Delgard had not spoken since the afternoon. She had requested her solicitor a coat and silence. Whimsy, passing through the drawing-room once more, glanced down at the now cold wax on the carpet, the closed curtains, the unlit fire. Bunter entered quietly. All is arranged for our departure, my lord. Excellent. I believe we've done what we can. The truth, Bunter, is rarely neat, but in this case, I dare say it's been told, which is the best one can manage with murder. Yes, my lord. Will we be returning to London? Tomorrow. Tonight I propose we enjoy one last dinner in this mausoleum of genteel rot. Perhaps the cook might be persuaded to part with the colonel's brandy. It would be a shame to let ghosts drink alone. As he descended the stair, he quoted softly, "All that we see or seem is but a dream within a dream." And then, as if remembering something of faint amusement, he added, "Except the tax bill. That, alas, is horribly real." The inquest was held beneath skies of such indifferent grey that even the gravestones seemed reluctant to cast shadows. Lord Peter Wimsey did not attend, claiming that the tea at Ivy Lodge had been so thoroughly dispiriting as to cause spiritual anemia. Instead, he sent a neat packet to the coroner, containing, among other things, a certified copy of Colonel Delgard's final letter to his solicitor, several annotated sketches of the drawing-room and its lighting, and a curious diagram of window latches and air drafts, which the coroner later declared perplexing but oddly convincing. Lady Delgard was formally charged with manslaughter. Her defense, delivered with the cold precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime mastering the tone of aggrieved superiority, rested upon her assertion that she had only meant to frighten her husband, not to kill him. "He was always so confident," she said once to Miss Blaine, not long before her removal to Holloway. "I wanted him to know what it felt like, to doubt the next moment." Wimsey, when informed of this, remarked that she had succeeded admirably, though not in the way she intended. Mr. Ricks, summoned post-haste from Lincoln's Inn, produced the colonel's revised testament and corroborated its dispatch. It proved to be the undoing of more than one tidy narrative. The courts eventually ruled that the deceased's intention, posted, signed, and registered, carried sufficient testamentary weight. Thus, Ivy Lodge and a substantial annuity passed, not to the widow, but to Miss Eleanor Blaine, who accepted the inheritance with the stunned posture of someone receiving an albatross gift wrapped in damask. But it was not wealth that lingered after the affair. It was something subtler and far less soluble. A change in air, a silence that was no longer quite restful. Several weeks later, over tea in a quiet Bloomsbury parlour, Harriet Vane observed Lord Peter staring at the steam rising from his cup as if it were a séance of unforthcoming spirits. "You've said hardly a word," she noted, with a gentle poke of one accustomed to his verbal fencing. "Have the ghosts failed to send their compliments?" "I was thinking," said Wimsey slowly, "that the colonel's last act of virtue was to understand his own villainy." Harriet raised an eyebrow, a rather elegant paradox. "My dear, morality is rarely more than elegant paradoxes dressed up for dinner. He left the candle burning not for light, but as invitation. And his wife accepted it as such. That, I suppose, is what we call justice, when 2 lifetimes of silent warfare finally strike the same match. And Miss Blaine? She survives. One does, you know, with the uncomfortable knowledge that one was loved in the wrong way and hated for the right reasons." Harriet was quiet for a moment. Then, "And what of you, Peter? Did you win?" He looked up with that curious glint behind the monocle, a flash of something deeper than amusement, older than irony. "Winning, my dear, is for games. In these matters, we merely endure with elegance." Later, he passed through the drawing-rooms of London with his usual distracted grace, speaking lightly of Greek hexameters and the alarming vulgarity of modern waistcoats. The newspapers, for their part, digested the case into a few polite columns. Retired colonel dies in bizarre accident. Widow in custody, and promptly moved on to the divorce of a vice-countess and the price of tea futures. Only those who'd been present in Ivy Lodge, those who'd heard the echo of old sins between tapestried walls, remembered the murder for what it was, a precise act of emotional vengeance, executed in the language of hearth and silence. And among them it was said that Lord Peter Wimsey had solved the mystery not with fingerprints nor footprints, but with a question that no one else had thought to ask. Why was the candle lit at all? And so the matter passed into the annals of polite forgetting, where most truths are filed. Wimsey, meanwhile, returned to his shelves, his buck, and his long walks through rain-soaked woods with Harriet, occasionally interrupting the stillness to quote some obscure Greek tragedy or grumble about the peculiar morality of electrical bills. Thus concluded the affair of Ivy Lodge, with one woman in prison, another in possession, and Lord Peter Wimsey once again proving that the most dangerous room in any house is the one in which people say nothing at all.